On the night of April 26, 1986, the world changed forever. In the north of Ukraine, in the quiet Polisian town of Pripyat, at the very heart of one of the Soviet Union's most powerful nuclear power plants, disaster struck. It was an explosion whose power and consequences surpassed anything humanity had ever known. Unit 4 of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant became a gaping, deadly wound on the face of the planet, spewing tons of radioactive poison into the atmosphere. This was not just an explosion. It was an open nuclear reactor, a blazing monster threatening to poison half of Europe. In the first hours, days, and weeks after the disaster, while the world stood frozen in horror and ignorance, a battle began. But it wasn't fought by soldiers with weapons in hand. Firefighters, engineers, miners, scientists, and pilots rushed into the fray. Hundreds of thousands of people who would later be known by a single word. They walked into the very inferno, into the invisible field of lethal radiation, to tame the nuclear genie that had escaped its bottle. Their weapons were shovels, helicopters, and their own courage. But when the initial fire was extinguished and the emissions were brought under control, humanity faced a new, even more daunting task. How could this monster be buried? How could the destroyed reactor be sealed for centuries so that it could never again threaten the world? Thus began one of the most monumental and desperate construction projects in history. The building of the first sarcophagus, the shelter object. It was a feat of engineering and human self, accomplished under unimaginable conditions in a race against time and death. Before we dive into the main story, we'd like to ask for a little support. A like and a subscription would be the best way to thank us. Thank you now. Get ready. We're heading into the heart of the Chernobyl exclusion zone to tell the true story of how the first tomb for the nuclear monster was built. Once the initial shock of the disaster subsided and the Soviet leadership finally grasped the true scale of what had happened, scientists and engineers faced several critical questions. The destroyed Unit 4 was not just a pile of radioactive debris. Uncontrolled processes were still raging within it. The molten nuclear fuel, mixed with sand, concrete, and metal, had turned into a lava-like substance they named coal. This mass, with a temperature reaching thousands of degrees, was melting through the concrete structures beneath the reactor. There was a real, terrifying threat that this lava would burn through the foundation slab and drop into the bubbler pool below, which was filled with water. Had that happened, a massive steam explosion would have followed, potentially destroying the other 3 reactors at the plant. This would have led to a catastrophe of planetary scale. The first and most urgent task was to pump the water out from under the reactor. This suicidal mission was carried out by 3 volunteers engineers, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bes, in diving suits, waist-deep in radioactive water and in complete darkness. They manually opened the sluice gates and drained the pool. They saved Europe from a second, even more terrible explosion, paying for it with their help. The second threat was the risk of groundwater contamination. The molten mass could have seeped into the ground and poisoned the Pripyat River, and then the Dnieper, leaving tens of millions of people without drinking water. To prevent this, it was decided to create a concrete cooling pad beneath the reactor. Thousands of miners were mobilized from all over the Soviet Union for this purpose. They worked in inhuman conditions, heat, cramped spaces, high humidity, and, of course, radiation. In 1 month and 4 days, they dug a 150-meter tunnel under the reactor and created a chamber for the future concrete slab. They worked stripped to the waist because the temperature reached 50 degrees Celsius. Each of them received a massive dose of radiation. But even after these 2 primary threats were neutralized, the main problem remained. The destroyed reactor continued to dust, releasing radioactive particles into the atmosphere with every gust of wind. It had to be covered, isolated from the outside world. Thus, the idea for the shelter object, or as it would later be known worldwide, the sarcophagus, was born. The task was unprecedented. A gigantic structure had to be erected over the destroyed reactor in the shortest possible time, amidst extremely high radiation levels where not only electronics but also people could not function for long. The design was developed in record time. The decision was made not to build a monolithic structure, but to assemble the sarcophagus from separate metal and concrete blocks, like a giant construction set. But how could it be done? The radiation levels on the roof of the surviving part of the turbine hall and around the reactor itself were so high that a person could receive a lethal dose in mere minutes. Robotics were called in to help. At first they tried to deploy Soviet's DR-1 and German Joker robots onto the roof. They were supposed to clear away chunks of highly radioactive graphite and debris, pushing them into the reactor's chasm. But here, the engineers were in for a cruel surprise. In the extreme radiation fields, the robots' electronics failed. They stopped, went haywire, the wiring melted, the expensive machinery turned into useless scrap metal. And when it became clear that the robots were powerless, people had to be sent into the fight. These men were called biorobots, conscripts, reservists, volunteers. They were dressed in makeshift lead armor that weighed up to 30 kg. Their task was simple and terrifying. Run out onto the roof, scoop up 1 or 2 pieces of graphite with a shovel, throw them over the edge, and immediately run back. The entire operation took between 40 and 90 seconds. In that short time, they received a dose of radiation that, in peace, was considered the maximum permissible limit for 5 years. More than 3,500 men went through this meat grinder. They cleared the roof at the cost of their own health, preparing it for construction. After the cleanup, the main phase of construction began. It was the most unusual construction project in history. Most of the work was done remotely. Giant German and Japanese cranes, operated from shielded bunkers, lifted and installed multi-ton steel beams and concrete panels. The most difficult part was installing the main beam, nicknamed Mammoth. This beam, 70 meters long and weighing 147 tons, had to span the central reactor hall. Its installation was a precision operation that everyone watched with bated breath. Any mistake could have led to a collapse and a new, massive release of radiation. But the virtuoso crane operators succeeded. Step by step, block by block, the walls and roof of the gigantic tomb rose above the destroyed reactor. Construction continued for 206 days and nights, without breaks or days off. More than 90,000 people took part. It was a true labor of heroism, performed under extreme conditions. Finally, in November 1986, the construction was completed. A structure over 55 meters high, made of 7,300 tons of steel and 400,000 cubic meters of concrete, stood over Unit 4. The nuclear monster was buried. On November 30th, the State Commission signed the acceptance certificate for the shelter object. It was a victory of the human spirit, courage, and intellect over the most destructive force it had ever unleashed. But everyone understood that this was only a temporary solution. The sarcophagus was built in a hurry with whatever materials were at hand. Its structure was not airtight. It had gaps and holes with a total area of over 1,000 square meters. It was not designed for a long service life. Its creators gave it a guarantee of only 30 years, a 30-year respite for humanity. Figure out how to solve the Chernobyl problem for good. The first sarcophagus, the shelter object, fulfilled its main purpose. It stopped the release of radioactive dust and bought the world precious time. But beneath its concrete vaults, a hidden life continued. The destroyed reactor remained a source of colossal danger. Scientists who began working inside the sarcophagus faced a reality that surpassed the darkest predictions. Radiation levels in some rooms were so high that remotely operated robots had to be used to install sensors. These sensors showed that about 200 tons of nuclear fuel, mixed with molten structures, the very same corium, remained inside the shelter. Some of this fuel had turned into glassy lava flows that solidified in the sub-reactor rooms. The most famous of these formations was named the Elephant's Foot. It was a solidified flow of corium that emitted so much radiation that a few minutes near it were lethal. Furthermore, the structure of the sarcophagus itself, built in a frantic rush, was becoming a growing concern. It rested on the blast-damaged walls of Unit 4, and no one could guarantee their long-term stability. Corrosion, radiation, and weather was slowly but surely destroying the tomb. There were numerous cracks in the roof and walls, through which rainwater seeped inside. This watery, upon contact with radioactive materials, turned into highly active liquid waste that collected in the lower rooms, creating a new threat of contamination. It became obvious that the first sarcophagus was not a solution, but merely a temporary patch on a gaping wound. Sooner or later it could collapse, leading to a new, catastrophic release of radioactive dust. The world needed a new, long-term, and safe solution. Thus, in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, an independent Ukraine turned to the international community for help. In 1997, the G7 countries and the European Commission signed an agreement to create the Chernobyl Shelter Fund and the Shelter Implementation Plan. Preparations began for the most ambitious engineering project in modern history, the construction of the new safe confinement, or as it is more commonly known, the Arch. The idea of the Arch was brilliant in its simplicity and monumental in its execution. Instead of trying to repair or reinforce the old, crumbling sarcophagus and risking the lives of workers, the decision was made to build a gigantic protective dome over it. But building it directly over the radioactive site was impossible. Therefore, a unique solution was adopted to build the Arch at a safe distance on a specially prepared site and then slide it over the old sarcophagus on rails. This allowed construction work to be carried out in safe conditions. The project was entrusted to the international consortium Novarca, led by French companies. Construction began on a project whose scale and complexity were unparalleled in the world. The dimensions of the Arch are staggering. Its height is 108 meters taller than the Statue of Liberty. Its length is 162 meters, and its span is 257 meters. The Cathedral of Notre Dame or several football fields could easily fit under its roof. The entire structure weighs over 36,000 tons, 3 times more than the Eiffel Tower. The arch consists of 2 halves that were assembled on the ground and then lifted and joined at the top. A system of dozens of powerful hydraulic jacks was used to lift these giant sections. Construction took over a decade, from 2007 to 2017. Thousands of engineers and workers from dozens of countries participated. It was a truly international project, a symbol of how humanity can unite in the face of a common threat. But the Arch is not just a giant steel hangar. It is a highly complex technological facility. Its double-skin cladding creates a sealed space, and a special ventilation system maintains negative pressure inside to ensure that not a single particle of dust can escape. But most importantly, hidden beneath the Arch's roof are giant robotic systems. This is a system of bridge cranes that can move along the entire length and width of the Arch. These cranes are equipped with various manipulators and tools. Their tasks, in the future, when the Arch is fully operational, is to begin the most complex and dangerous phase, the dismantling of the old, unstable sarcophagus and the extraction of the radioactive materials remaining inside. All these operations will be carried out remotely, without human involvement. Operators will be in a safe command center, controlling the robots as if in a video game. This process will take decades, possibly until the end of the 21st century. It is the slow, painstaking work of finally burying the nuclear monster. In November 2016, a historic moment arrived. The gigantic Arch, built and assembled on a safe site, began to move. Using 224 hydraulic jacks that pushed the structure 60 centimeters per cycle, it was slowly slid over the old shelter object over several days. It was an incredible sight. The giant, silvery structure, the largest movable land-based structure in history, slowly crept across the ground to cover the source of deadly danger forever. When the Arch reached its designated position, the world breathed a sigh of relief. The Chernobyl wound was securely isolated for at least 100 years, the designed service life of the new safe confinement. This has given humanity another, much longer, time out to develop the technologies for the final disposal of the molten fuel. The story of the construction of the sarcophagi, the first, built on heroism and self-sacrifice, and the second, created through the pinnacle of modern technology and international cooperation, is one of the most dramatic and instructive sagas in human history. It is a story of a monstrous mistake that led to a catastrophe, and of the incredible feat that allowed it to be tamed. It is a reminder of the colossal and destructive power that man has unleashed, and of the responsibility we bear to future generations. And when we look today at the majestic and silent silhouette of the Arch, rising above the Palæstian forests, we must remember the thousands of nameless heroes, their firefighters, miners, soldiers, and engineers. In 1986, stepped into the inferno to build the first tomb for the nuclear monster and save the world. Your support, a like, and a subscription are very important to us. And don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date and never miss our new videos.